Luke Tay has served for close to 2 decades in various foresight, strategy, people development, and internationally oriented roles in Singapore's public service. He holds a BA in History and International Relations and an MA in Political Science. He's also a community volunteer, a military reserve officer, and an avid alternate history buff. So Luke's foresight research has particularly addressed the future of food transport, food, urban systems, international development, and their interplay in the context of shifting geopolitics and unsettled Earth systems. Without further ado, I'm giving the floor or the screen out to our Master Chef speaker of the hour, Luke Tay.
The futures of food. Okay, so let me just go through some brief exposition to root us. I think this should be familiar to many of us. The SDGs obviously describe many things that we want to move the world towards. Zero hunger is number 2, but I suggest to you that probably many of the other nice pictures also involve in one way or the other the food system. Here's the textbook definition of food security. All people, all times, have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food to meet their dietary needs. And the crucial part that is often overlooked is and food preferences for an active and healthy life. So I think that's just to frame the discussion. This is a very interesting exhibit of the food system that I think embeds a lot of the assumptions and ways that we currently do things, today's paradigm. So for example, mentioning economic growth, the fact that food is processed, food wasn't processed to begin with until we began to be more civilized. Well, okay, until the big C came along, I think the other issue with this is all these red things, that the transport icons, must things be shuffled around from when you start making the food to when it's consumed. Okay, so I think our modern food system is a legacy of the Cold War era Green Revolution, where selective breeding led to great boosts in plant and animal agriculture, including through the application of a lot of fertilizer, a lot of pesticides, and so on. As the food system's grown, so have some challenges: deforestation, effluent, antimicrobial resistance. And the food system has moved to the sound of the guns. Now we are heavily urban civilization. And the urban food system also has its challenges. The double burden, so-called, of malnutrition. Some people eating too much, getting heart disease. Cancer is also what are you eating? Well, there are also people who are malnourished or who have micronutrient deficiencies that lead to stunting, intellectual gaps, and so on. Okay, and then there's a big resource take for the food system and emissions footprint. These are just some graphicalizations. A big land take, a big squeezing out of biodiversity, a lot of eutrophication, ocean pollution, and so on. So that's what we have today. And also quite a measure of waste in terms of the food produced not being consumed, and very limited circularity. Problematize people's diets today, where a lot, especially in the developed world, in the middle income countries, are transiting actually to high protein diets with big take in terms of resource. Okay, and the food system is a big deal. If we look at GDP-wise, or we look at employment, be it in low-income countries where I guess you live closer to the earth and there's more dependency, more prominence for the system just for survival, up to high-income countries, is a big part of the economy. So I think when we talk about problematizing the food system, is also looking at the consequence of any positive shifts based on different philosophies. Climate emergency, I'll fast forward over this. I think this is an important graph that shows how actually since the 90s, food insecurity had been going down. But midway through the last decade, unfortunately, there was a reversal. And I think most food scholars point to a few reasons why. The effects being felt of global heating and the climate emergency, and also displacement of some people that spurs food insecurity. Reactions to the challenges, people pushing for a new Green Deal, people looking at more progressive diets. And yeah, just I'm coming to the main argument now. So the last part, I guess, of the ongoing ferment in the food system is really just some new waves of food choices. So finish your vegetables, please. Some of these things don't really look like vegetables, but that's the rise of plant proteins. Okay, and Winston Churchill, not a very woke guy, but he was quite right, except that he was maybe 40 years off in his prediction on cellular agriculture coming up. And this is a slide from the Boston Consulting Group showing a projection of how plant-based, microorganism-based, talking about like, fungi, microfungi, and eventually animal cell-based. You have waves of innovation and different scenarios for its mainstreaming in the food system as a meat alternative. Okay, and then I think on the cusp of COVID, we had maybe these movements, one calling for a great reset. I think this is World Economic Forum, Davos men speak, and maybe from the ferment from below, Greta Thunberg and company looking at Extinction Rebellion, saying that the elites really have got things wrong, they're getting things worse. We need to have a rupture, discontinuity. And then the big C came. And okay, so a flavor of some other things happening right now with the coronavirus. I think we had a very insightful panel on fake news. My pet theory that I haven't done enough research on, so it's something for discussion, is that right now there's a lot of misinformation, anti-vax movement that may or may not be informed by science. And the jury's still out on how we'll come out of the coronavirus pandemic. And since we have mRNA vaccines, and since we are trying to science up to meet the challenge, the jury is out on the global public's verdict on this science. I know that the mRNA isn't in the same neck of the woods as, for example, CRISPR food, gene-edited species of plants and animals. But I think that the verdict the global public opinion has on the vaccines will be transferable to people's openness, for example, to agri-biotech, synbio, and so on, that I'm not saying is an unvarnished good thing, but that at least has some promise to enhance the sustainability, the productivity of the food system. Okay, I love this slide. In the early coronavirus crisis, one example of food misinformation was that I think someone put a humorous podcast out there saying that there would be food aid delivered at Wembley Stadium in London in the form of a giant lasagna. And some people believed it. It makes me think of H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, where I think 100 years ago, there was a radio broadcast about alien invasion that did spawn some mass panic here and there. Okay, we have also in various ways, including since COVID, there have been supply chain stresses, inflation, and so on. And so it's not a happy place. I think one more interesting trend to note, if you look at the litany on the food security challenge, it had been that, in 2050, there'll be 10, 11 billion people, we have to double our production, But I think it's already come up early in the conference that that might not be so. There's already a COVID birth dip, and that adds to other people for, I guess, ideological reasons, thinking I don't want to bring a new child into this world that would cause more emissions and that would face the climate emergency in full force. Incidentally, I'm a father of 2 young children, so I definitely feel this anxiety about the future and paying it forward. One interesting scenario out there from the London futurist Simon Mayer that interested me was this take on, what would the immediate reaction be? And this one scenario I'll present you is my thought on the nearer term adjustments of the food system to building back better after COVID. So anyway, the two axes of the scenario were, would there be a centralized response where I guess modern civilization as we know it largely holds together the interstate system, or will things break down to more micro level? And the other axis was, would we continue with the current paradigm where we're looking at economic value as the main principle, or would we go to maybe a post-material type of focus? And then on the left side of the shop, you have state capitalism and state socialism. So I think the state has definitely tried to step up in these troubled times, including in the food system, and I'll elaborate on that. And perhaps the so-called failure mode in inverted commas might be if we move to the right, but is that such a failure? Okay, so that's just a brief tour of the horizon on what's up in the food system. And let me just go through my argument and then go into the main part of my sharing. So needless to say, food underpins human life and civilization. And while food has enabled the Anthropocene, I've showed you examples of how it's also part of the problem and part of the imprint on the world system, the negative imprint. The chickens are coming home to roost. So we're on a burning platform, and I guess that's why we're talking about the future of food. So the second point is that the food system shapes the world system. Of course, being an essential and having such a big imprint on the economy, on the workforce, on the biosphere, and so on. So I think that most people would want the food system from being a net ecological problem to move towards being a net contributor to the solution. So how fast, far, to what extent, and in what way it does will have really a strong bearing on the next human chapter. So that's the second point. The third point, I think, is I will suggest to you some ingredients and cooking tips, to use the very gastronomic metaphor of the whole conference that's quite apt for this one. So I'll go into that more. Questions of technology, questions of making the point that we think often of the supply side, at least if you're in enterprise or in government, but the demand side is equally crucial. And then trying to game things through from a 3P model, looking at the providers. I consciously didn't mention the private sector, but people who are in food enterprises. Okay, then of course the politics, policy, community, domestically, internationally, and certainly the people sector, which I think has stood up and become far more active and activist again as the box was shaken by the COVID emergency. Okay, and the last part, for me, I'm a political scientist and historian by training, not a food scientist, So don't take my food advice, but you can note my opinions. The world system, tell me the future of the world system and I'll tell you how we'll eat, until we maybe totally exit the stage. So what are some very cursory visions of the world system, and how may the food system step up to the plate in each of these futures? Okay, so I'll get going on this. This graph just shows the modern food system, whereby agricultural imports and exports have been rising. So it's basically been becoming more globalized. And this accelerated with the end of the Cold War. Of course, we're in a new Cold War now, it seems. I think one way to look at the challenge, to frame it, is that there's a sense of urgency and opportunity right now to rethink and transform food security and food system resilience sustainably for people and planet. So that's how I'll frame the discussion. Okay, so in thinking about this, I came up with this mandala of the food system. It's not an original thought. It's just a way to put things together to make an argument about the parts, the sum of the parts. So this so-called onion model, or if you come from the Philippines, I suggested that this is a balut. It's like a kind of like little chick within a shell type of model. Talks about concentric circles of where food is made and where food is consumed. Okay, and how the COVID emergency and other initiatives are problematizing this and looking for a better solution than the status quo. So I'll fast forward through this and then share the takeaways. So I think for a start, especially with lockdowns and people's careers, lives being disrupted, there's been more focus on producing food right at home, right in your backyard in various ways, low tech to high tech. People in apartments, people with balconies, people with corridors have been stacking them up with greens. And there are also higher tech equipment right here and in development that can lead to a far wider range of nutrients, perhaps being produced at home. And then the next rung would be in the community, whether it be on commercial lines or even just on community volunteering, community self-help lines, community gardens, allotments, food kitchens, to up circularity, reduce wastage, redistribute food to the needy, exchange food. In my country, for example, a lot of rooftops of parking lots have been converted to farms, as well. So on the commercial side, rooftop hydroponic, aquaponic farms. Okay, then we go to the city level as well. I'll touch more on some of the technologies coming up. Here are just some visuals. So whereas previously the thinking for literally millennia had been that the city takes what the countryside makes, could this be something that could be stood on its head in the future? And what may the unvarnished good consequences be? And some of the other second and third order consequences if we think in terms of a future's wheel, just to think about that. Okay, then I think when we deal with urban and peri-urban food systems, to use some food community jargon, there's been a lot of questions on, just like we have the watershed for a city, what is the food shed? What is the viable boundary around the city, and how much food can it produce to at least in part meet the city's needs? Okay, so let me jump into this a bit more. Just to say there's a lot of technologies there, algae, microfungi, and so on, that are amenable to indoor or very intense production. And so it becomes viable in an urban setting, indoor farms as well, rooftop, and so on. And I think London has been pioneering, among other places, underground farms, some that need light, some that don't. That's where mushrooms are very useful. As a provocation, at the top right, I put a blimp that could be for fulfillment, floating spice gardens, floating agri-food hubs, and also, at sea. Okay, this is something that, hi Ed, I see you're in the audience. Ed and I some time ago worked on this futures triangle. I think just to touch on how, from a city perspective, you can look at what's the weight of the past, the push or challenges currently facing cities. Of course, I'm from a city state, so this is highly relevant. But given that most of the world population is urban, I think it's an issue for all of us, and what the future can hold. Okay, so I won't talk through all these tiles, but one concept that I've been developing is what city with technology permeating it can do to have a highly circular, efficient, and self-actualizing food system. But of course, there you can put on a question of challenge as well. If you have a surveillance nanny state, they could probably do a lot more to penalize excessive cheeseburger eating, or to incentivize healthy lifestyles. Or even to tell you should really eat this precise food in this precise amount to reduce the healthcare system burden. But what does that do for individual liberty and privacy and agency? So that's it. This is one way to think of different tiles of a smart city food brain that takes surveillance and maybe even takes charge of managing the nutrition metabolism of a city for high self-sufficiency, high circularity. It knows and can put in more resource to produce more food. It can manage food flows both in normal times and also in times of disruption. Okay, so and looking at the city region, this is just an exhibit of a very simple prototype that I did. I think if you look at Arab, for example, the infrastructure consultancy, they probably have gone to the nth degree on stuff like this. But it's just to create a sense of what are the possibilities in and around cities, including in C squares for food production. So in this case, imagining like a 20 by 20 kilometer metropolitan core with a 60 by 60 periphery. So this is what Chicago is like, overlaid on that, and then thinking not with a maximal case of abundant land, but with different types of terrain squares, what might be production possibility. Okay, and then for someone interested in international relations like me, now we go to things that are beyond sovereign borders, but not quite global. So this is where I think there's a lot of possibility for new imaginaries, new geographies. And I'm not saying that, again, in a totally positive way. You can have food pacts, you can have outbound agricultural investment to your friends and allies, a trusted circle of people to help each other with guns and butter and what have you, for example. Could there also be more food regionalism? For example, at ASEAN level, one of the discussions was that there are so many food flows in and out of the region, but a strange, relative, limited amount of food flows within. So can at regional level a more resilient and sufficient food system be built up to complement interregional food flows? And then, of course, you've got the world. Okay, and beyond the world, you've got some other places just to mention as provocations again. Of course, there's some aspiration to go into space, including for certain types of food production. One thing quite overlooked are blue economy futures, the sea. I think there's a lot more upside potential for food production at sea, under the sea, and near the shore, but on the sea. And lastly, if we have replacement of humans with a bit more cyborg humanoid type of strain, then you need less food and perhaps more energy, and there may be less wastage that way. Okay, so with that tour of the different rings of the onion, let me come to just this set of scenarios that I did up in consultation with quite a few food thinkers. So basically here, to me, the greatest critical uncertainties, if the question is, where will food be made, how will it flow over the medium term, maybe the next 10 years, spurred on by the COVID disruption? I think it boils down to two key questions. One, how viable is how much upside potential is there for more food to be produced closer to demand in cities, around cities, for example? And this is not just an agronomic or technological question, but coming to the demand side, it's also about social license. It's also about, will people eat? Do they have the affordability for it? And is there policy support? And also, will enterprises stand up? Is there a business case? Or the state will have to come in to spur that. The other dimension is, how nasty are things? How scary are things in the wider world? So you may be able to do a lot more, but is there a reason to? So then you matrix it, and let me bring you through a tour of these worlds. Firstly, if doing more locally is highly viable and the world is a highly nasty place, then there'll probably be a lot more local production, near sourcing of food by people who can, And I think that this maps to the wider conversation right now of whether, microchips, for example, COVID vaccines and treatments and all that should be near short and reshort or kept in a value chain among your best buddies. So in this world, there will probably be a gated greenhouse where people really throwing a lot of technology, a lot of capital. If you have it, you have your food smart cities. And the rest of the people, well, tough for them, On the other hand, if for whatever reason, maybe limits in the advance of technology, for example, the local production viability compared to today is somewhat limited, then maybe we'll have what I call a new Cold War in the fridge. Agronomically, things are pretty much the way they are in terms of comparative advantage, but then you've just got the natural process I wouldn't say natural, the unnatural process by which the climate emergency is shifting the viability of growing stuff. So for example, in the northern hemisphere, the arable lands for wheat are moving north, so that's Siberia's gain, but maybe the Black Sea area's loss, and equivalent in North America, and so on and so forth. So anyway, in this scenario, you can't grow much more if you're a food deficit country than you have right now. So you have to depend on international trade. And this scenario also envisages that there's a lot more international confrontation. And so you've got maybe a scenario where powerful and agri-surplus countries really wear the pants and call the shots. And I'll elaborate in another slide on that, so I won't touch on it so much here. So then we look at the bottom left, where high viability, but the world ain't so bad, So in this scenario, maybe we'll have just some places, due to their own economic development strategies, deciding, okay, yep, I'll go ahead, develop my food sector more. I've got some niche cultural product, I've got some niche technology, and so then there'll be 1,000 flowers blooming, different, a lot of variety, and in terms of culinary legacies from different places, culinary novelties in pockets of innovation. So just a lot of diversity. Then finally, if we look at the bottom right, so again, I'll elaborate in another slide. But if there's low viability and also low reason to do more, then you may have a little bit more of the same. Maybe a restoration of what the 90s and early 2000s look like. Just globalization chugging along, but of course with a ceiling that's getting lower and lower imposed by the climate emergency. You've got a big supply grid, food can be pulled from everywhere else, the comparative advantage just rolls on. Okay, so that was one set of scenarios that I did some months ago, but then that got me thinking, okay, what's the tail, what's the dog, So the world system is the dog, the food system is the tail, that wags the dog, So if you follow that logic, I know that's not very academic, but then what's the dog doing? And then let's look at what the tail does. And does that map together? So here you have, I wouldn't use the S word scenarios, but on these two axes, I talk about how imagine a world situation based on how much is run towards the advancement of human welfare on one axis, and on the other axis, how much is geared towards restoring, advancing planetary well-being, in reversing the climate emergency. So based on this, my thought is that the world system could be in the red right now, So why there? So right now, people are talking about how perhaps we are trending towards a new Cold War. Hopefully, touch wood, not a new hot war, but it is getting hotter with the climate emergency. So we're not handling planetary well-being so well. The Anthropocene is weighing down on itself, and even for human well-being, it's being compromised because yes, the 1%, the 2%, the wealthier world has it fairly good, but overall is weighing down right now on aggregate human welfare. So that's one state. Then we have, okay, what are all these others? So one point of view is that if internationalism, if great power, superpower cooperation can be restored, then perhaps in Sky, Dragon, Eagle scenario, there can be renewed cooperation towards a more ecological outcome that also advances human welfare. Could that be possible? For example, if the US and China make nice, there can be a climate accord, of course, throwing in the Europeans who are known as a regulatory superpower and have pioneered things like emissions trading, uh, emissions caps, and so on. So could we improve in that space? And on the top right, this is maybe a nirvana-like state, or closer to that if possible, where is there really a green cultural revolution, where there is a secular transformation in social and consumer attitudes towards circular economy, maybe degrowth, and maybe greater internationalism, but less nation state, and some sort of green nirvana scenario. The polar opposite is what I call, with some wordplay, the exit or exist scenario. So if stuff happens, stuff hits the fan, So let me maybe elaborate on that later. So I just have a few more slides, and then we can go to the discussion. Let me talk about the red and the blue circles first. So another scenario that I came up with and shoehorned into this is really thinking about, okay, red is now this Cold War II thing on the left, and then the blue one is so-called abundance road win-win superpower co-opetition. To think about what this would look like in a more granular way. I won't take the time to go through all of this. I'll just maybe pick and choose a few things to give a bit more of a flavor of what these scenarios would look like. I think following the analogy of a Cold War, you might have a very frozen in place international system of armed camps. You may have a flailing, non-aligned zone. And the key point here is that food is a weapon. Food aid is a weapon. Food trade is a weapon. Food assistance, including on the technological front, is a weapon. And between opposing blocs, there's a lot of sensitivity to the sharing or the leakage of technology. There's a lot of misinformation, information operations by different bad actors. There's probably, in this confrontational mode, more state command and control of strategic resource sectors, and food would be among them. Climate change probably won't be so well handled in this area, so it will be just about coping, about adaptation. And part of the adaptation might be going for more command economy. Geoengineering, for people who are familiar with it, I'm certainly not suggesting that this is a good thing, but it's certainly being explored. And as we slip further into the climate red zone, more people are saying we've just got to suck our thumbs and do it. So there might be a very self-centered type of geoengineering activities going on here. And you could have maybe loyalty tests based on food. So the cuisines of the other camp would become taboo to eat. So I'll skip over the nice part in blue, but I think it's somewhat of a mirror image to the scenario I've described on the left. Okay, so just a bit of show and tell in terms of pictures. I'm old enough to remember the last Iraq war, where I think France didn't support the US. So in America, Ed, tell me if I'm wrong, French fries were rebranded as freedom fries, at least in the Congress, for example. And I think all this like food connection with nationalism and identity politics just carries on. I think it's global. In Southeast Asia, there's also some somewhat friendly tongue-in-cheek disputes about who originated certain dishes that are cooked across borders. Okay, so let me talk about the exit scenario briefly. So, so what will the world population be like, if there's a worse pandemic than COVID, if there's a hot war that might turn nuclear and so on, there'll be a lot of exit, unfortunately. Game over. And you can't just press to try again. Okay, so there may be a lot of mushrooms around, so the mushroom clouds of nuclear winter. In all seriousness, there are people who are looking at what it takes after a global catastrophe such as that, or super volcano or asteroid impact, to preserve at least the human remnant. There's the glamorous version also of people prepping for the apocalypse, be it from zombies or those other outcomes. here are just some views of that. And of course, there's also a prepper movement that is out there among a lot of backwoods people and even some urbanites as well, thinking that we need to be prepared. The question is for what? Okay, so one image of the future that I borrowed from the failed blockbuster sci-fi movie Mortal Engines that came out 2 years ago is this concept of a traction city. I think it's a good metaphor, So in a world where the climate has changed, there's a surviving remnant. The remnant will survive maybe by being anti-fragile, by actually getting stronger or dominating situations in the chaos. So this is beyond resilience. So the traction city is a good metaphor for it, where in the movie, cities are on big rails, on big treads, tank treads, and they move around, leaching resources from the degraded earth and swallowing smaller traction cities. So the issue here is that, I guess if you have anarchy, the war of all against all, this might be people living hand to mouth and not thinking of the common welfare, But can we have a better state where in this anarchy, there are better values of mutual assistance as well as self-help? Okay, I'll just touch briefly on technology. Notice I put it in inverted commas. So here are not some specific technologies, but some requirements, I think, for whichever future in terms of what technologies, combinations of technologies can do. Firstly, for urban and peri-urban food systems, can they become far more fecund food sheds, to handle more of their own needs, but also to be able, in a situation of disruption, to help each other? So breaking it down, of course, technologies for production, but crucially, technologies for greater circularity. Personalized nutrition I'll talk about. And I think one other key aspect to get the demand side on a more progressive track will be how do you inform people and how do you persuade them in a way that is still people-centered and not nanny state or even coercive. So technologies in a broader sense. Technologies for food production to be more ESG in general, beyond just in urban nodes. Okay, then this thing I've playfully titled New Heaven and New Earth. I'll show you an example of that later. High-tech shamanism, positive interventions into the land system and the sky system. Okay, food, energy, water, resilience technologies. And I think I'll just go on to show you some pictures. I did none of these. I've grabbed most of these from various sources on the internet. So one picture of what technology and design can do, especially with rising sea levels, we may need to become a more seaborne species, and certainly there's a lot more that can be done to restore depleted capture fisheries, but also to produce more food on a farmed basis, but ecologically at sea. Or can there be? This is my challenge. Another image of the future is can we have agroforestry as one way to extract food while preserving our great tracts of natural jungle and even restoring, rewilding certain areas. So this might be a partnership between the first peoples of those areas and high technology. Imagine an image of high-tech food foragers and rangers next time who can support themselves and maybe add to the wider food system as well, and also climate positive, carbon sink, and producing more food while restoring and preserving environments. So this is another image of that, different ways to grow things and become more sustainable at the same time. Okay, on this image, I'm showing something that's already being tried, the Great Green Wall Initiative, basically to hold back desertification. So I think that there's a lot of potential for us to really up our game in this. Can various sets of technologies, push the desert back, preserve And this would be to mitigate the effect of climate change in a more localized area. So what it would require, for example, among other things, would be bioremediation technologies, the development and planting of plant species and animal species to create a biosphere that is resistant to inclement weather, to drought, and maybe can even generate more clouds, more precipitation, stable water systems locally without increasing the resource take. Back to geoengineering, I think there are a lot of methods that have been suggested right now, and many of them are very problematic, including from a point of view, if you stop doing it, the global heating may go into a death spiral. So I'm just putting this out there, more just to note that some people are looking at this. One interesting thing that has come about is some people are developing technologies to suck air in, put it through a bacterial membrane, and produce food, protein powder, for example, and so food out of thin air. Sounds great, right? But it needs a lot of energy, So where's that energy coming from? Is it clean, renewable energy, or are you just transferring the source of the problem elsewhere, one pocket to another? All right, so I think I'll just share this last thought in terms of technology and applying it. I've been thinking more about personalized nutrition. Can I have a show of hands? How many of you guys have heard of Theranos, Elizabeth Holmes? Did I get her name right? Anyway, the company Theranos, that I think they're facing a lot of lawsuits. They had a technology that supposedly would just take a pinprick of blood and give you a holistic health picture for yourself. So anyway, just to talk about personalized nutrition. I think today, in similar fashion, you can do a cheek swab and then you go send it to a company and you get a lab report saying eat this, don't eat that, to reach your health optimum. So, but I think this the point is that this technology is very nascent and very patchy. So in the future, however, our knowledge of body systems and how nutritional interventions can shape them will advance. And it's not just about preventive healthcare, but it's about mood, mental health, maybe meeting your sports or your career goals, and so on. So, and then you can translate this knowledge also into food products and solutions. But the key thing that is also missing and overlooked sometimes is gustation. Does it taste good? Does it make you feel happy? Is it something you can consume together with your friends? So I think in a nutshell, I'm thinking about how personalized nutrition in the future can be something that not just an elite can enjoy right now if they have the money to pay for such services, but can it be aggregated to population scaled nutrition? Can everyone benefit from it? And then if so, what would the technologies and processes look like for that? And from an admin point of view, what would the government of a certain jurisdiction and what would the corporate players in that jurisdiction, how they design such a system? So I'll just leave it as that. Talking about the potential upside, I think that the key point here is that if we can have everyone optimally receiving optimal nutrition, then perhaps we can have our cake and eat it. You can have all these benefits for the individual, but for the society, you can have better healthcare outcomes. You can have maybe more productivity, and from an environmental perspective, you could probably severely you could probably curb food waste a lot. So this is an idea of the future that I just wanted to challenge and excite you with. Okay, so my last point now is that one of the key fractures that I see, potential fractures or hinges of uncertainty, will be really what type of world are we going for? Are we going for degrowth, or are we going towards maybe a more ephemeral picture of how technology and everything else can help us up human welfare and planetary welfare at the same time? There's a school of thought called eco-modernism. It posits that we'll get there in terms of abundant energy. Humankind can retreat into highly smart, highly concentrated cities, leaving most of the world to rewild and recover from environmental ravages. So we can enjoy and the earth can move on. How much that's possible and how much effort is put into this versus to this, I think will be one axis of the future of food. Okay, so this just recaps my argument, and I think some things I wanted to challenge and put for discussion. So clearly we need new imaginaries and paths to transcend the current limitations and ill effects of the food system. So I've suggested to you certain imaginaries and scenarios. I think that I'm cautiously optimistic. I think that global food security within planetary boundaries is within reach. It's not that we lack the technology or the will. It's a socio-political, economic challenge. And maybe that's where we'll fall into the exit scenario if we don't meet that challenge. It's doable, but how will we do it? I think point two, the key point I wanted to bring is that a lot of people, close to half of the people in the world are involved in the food system beyond just eating, which would be 100% unless you're dead, right? So this is the big tail that we need to think of as elites when we talk about renovating the food system. Whatever utopian project you have has to carry these people along, unless you're saying, hey, these folks have to exit. So think of the people. Number three, there are a lot of food tribes, a lot of ideologies and agendas. So are there too many cooks, and will they spoil the broth, or can they work together in a big field kitchen for the whole of humanity? And I think geopolitics clearly has a big part to play. And I think the last thing I leave with you is maybe we can use some of the scenarios I put out as a foil. So again, I think how the world system trend, yes, will be shaped by the food system, but it will probably carry the gravity in which the food system just has to adapt. So are we in a Cold War, hot war scenario? Are we falling in the sink towards exit? Is Sky Dragon Eagle something we want to aspire to? And what will the green cultural revolution look like if we can even get there? That's why I said the youth panel is interesting and the disaster panel is also interesting. So let's bring all these takeaways into the discussion now. So with that, thank you so much for your attention to my rant, and let's hear from you.
Okay, thank you, Luke, and thank you for Rand. Actually, your hefty servings of future scenarios and macro really got me thinking. I was just looking for that soylent green situation, but yeah, it's good. So I'm just going to merge, in the interest of time, going to merge some questions that I picked out from the chat. And this really connects to what you were saying when you framed at the first part about food preferences, and you ended also with the personalized nutrition note. And there was a question thrown in the chat about, let's say, plant-based meat leaving the world population behind because the processes are energy intensive. And how does it connect to with one of the points here in the chat when they were discussing about, instead of secular or moving forwards in a secular fashion, how about the green nirvana, the traditional spiritual metaphor where we get, we root ourselves with traditional practices in order to really ensure that food security for everyone. So we would just want to hear your thoughts or pulse on these things.
Peachy, is that a question for me or for the
okay, sorry, for you. That's for you. Yeah, I just kind of merged those questions, yeah, for you. And
okay,
what would you be?
I think my own critique of my scenarios is that my green nirvana scenario is very patchy because honestly, I lack the processing capacity to see a clear path there. I can have some sketchy narratives towards it. And I guess the other cop-out I would say is that, all scenarios are abstractions. To some extent, certain scenarios can be the case for certain parts of the world, rather than the whole world being in a certain scenario or not, perhaps. But I think that the green scenario, maybe the most enduring change, as other people have mentioned, comes from if there's really a secular change in values of people. So I think one way to say is that, okay, the younger generation, yeah, we've dumped on them all their problems, our problems, so what do they do with it? There's certainly this groundswell of new values, new perspectives, Greta Thunberg and company, but as this generation moves into adulthood and takes over the mantle of various global movements, be they the elite organizations or the stuff from below, what do they do with it? So I think that would be one source of going towards perhaps a greener path. A second will be if there's some sort of rupture, a big disaster, a conflict, and then the reset may happen in that way, but that reset may be among a remnant.
Okay, thank you for that, Luke. And if I probably may ask you, is it the time to level the playing field? And we only have a handful of corporations controlling our food from farm to fork, and we've seen and there's a note about the dramatic imbalance of power between producers and corporations. And we're impacted by the unmitigated consolidation in industrial agriculture. Well, what is your take on this? Like, how do we move forward with that dramatic imbalance of power?
I see. Okay, so again, these are all my personal views. I'm not very ideological about this, So I think that from a human welfare perspective, like the market economy is a means to an end, So I think that and there's a whole continuum of ways in which the food system, which is largely market-based right now, may shift. So I've suggested that in this time of the acute COVID crisis and now the long COVID crisis, the state has been stepping up in many instances, to prevent disorder, maybe to preserve its monopoly on power, and so on, to somehow regulate any market failures, or to enable the market economy and the food value chain to carry on as best can. For example, when there were lots of lockdowns in large countries, but there was a green lane, a priority lane for essentials like food, or likewise lockdown of the workforce, but a green lane for the food workers, So I'm not doctrinaire about, what is the ideal way, but I think certainly there are a lot of policy experiments all around the world, in terms of how things get done. And one common denominator, as I pointed out, is that there seemed to be a big grassroots swelling of self-help, because if companies fail you, if governments are constrained, you've got to look out for yourself. And the selfish way is to really just look out for yourself, or the more enlightened way is to look out for your community. So I think there's been a lot of community self-help. And if that is successful, if it can leverage on technology, you've got a lot of people on furlough who are educated, scientific people, engineers, people with a technical background, biologists, so if they can hack their way, adapt their way to more sustainable food systems locally that are more self-sufficient, then that will be one way that the food base evolves as well. But I guess the last point on this is that if there's really a very major crisis, like, I mean, in history, if there's like in World War II, all the capitalist economies also went into a war communism type of phase where you nationalize, where you ration. I think in extreme environmental scenarios, that may be the most likely outcome in many places, that you need to ration things, even at the point of a gun, to make sure that your society can carry on, that it won't exit.